Chris Mikowski for the American Battlefield Trust. Excited to have you with us here for the Overland 160th. We're at Spotsylvania and we're going to walk across one of the most iconic landscapes of the entire Civil War in this video. I've got with me behind the camera Professor Andy Bolton. Thank you very much for being with us today. We've got Dan Davis, we've got Sarah K. Byerly, we've got Chris White. Gary Edelman is on location in Gettysburg or at the office. You take your pick. Is he working? Is he out in the field? Who knows? But we won't see him today. What we will see today, though, is one of the most fantastic landscapes possible to explore as you're out doing Civil War stuff. So we're right now at a spot a lot of people don't make it out to. This is the Landram Farm. It's at the end of a farm lane called Landram Lane, and here is where Winfield Scott Hancock is going to make his headquarters during the Battle of Spotsylvania Court House. You can see the remains of the chimneys from the house behind me. That house does catch fire during the battle and burns down. The chimneys are all that's left. There's actually a cellar for an ice house off in that direction. And as Andy turns the camera in this direction, we'll see the remains of Landram Lane, which we're going to explore in a few minutes as well. And this is going to serve as a federal artillery platform as the attack gets going on May 12, 1864. Federal cannon are going to line up all along that road, try to blast at the Confederate position. Now the Federals get into this position overnight on the night of May 11th to May 12th. Ulysses S. Grant, thinking about the success that they've had with Upton's breakthrough on the 10th, which you can see in a previous video, he's going to say, like, well, what's the next move? What can I learn from that successful attack that I can apply here at this next attempt to break through Lee's lines? He continues to probe at Lee's left along it's the Spindle Field front, which we have explored already. He continues to probe along the Fredericksburg Road where Ambrose Burnside is, using him against Lee's right. But this center still looks like it is a vulnerable spot. In a previous video, Chris White talked about the large U shape in the Confederate line, the Mule Shoe Salient, because it's shaped like a big horseshoe or mule shoe. And it's susceptible from attack from a bunch of different directions. Mule Shoe Salient is also susceptible to crossfire, and if you break through at any spot along the line, you're in the rear of the whole position, and so it makes the whole position untenable. So that's why Grant wants to try to find some way to break through against that Confederate spot. Now, from where we're standing, Andy is looking off in that direction. The Confederate line is in that tree line we can see in the far distance, and the tip of that mule shoe is off to my right from where we're standing. So it's going to start curving back down that direction to the south and to the east, and in that direction to the west and the south. So the very tip of the mule shoe is over here. And because Upton had success with that column formation, his 12 regiments that punched through, Grant wants to try to emulate that. But he's not going to put all of his horses in one basket, his eggs in that one basket. So he's going to come up with a formation that's going to use that column, and he's going to have another more traditional line of battle in support of that. And as he's going to exert pressure here, he's going to ask Warren to once again attack across Spindle Field. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get going. And he's going to ask Burnside to push from his position as well, not just straight down the Fredericksburg Road, but against the east face of the mule shoe over here. So he's going to throw the whole army in all at once. That's one of the problems Grant's had during this whole campaign, is he's had a lot of piecemeal attacks. He's never been able to get everybody all in all at once. Warren's failures at Spindle Field on the 8th of May. Piecemeal, piecemeal, piecemeal. Grant wants everyone all in. And with all that pressure, he's convinced that Grant is going to break. Before we head down Landram Lane and start looking at the field and talking a little bit more in detail about the story, I want to bring Dan Davis on because we've got a great preservation story here, and he's literally wearing the word preserve on his chest today.
Thanks, Chris. Hey there, everyone. As Chris mentioned, we're at a location that a lot of people don't really get out to, but it's here not because of the American Battlefield Trust, but an organization that existed in the late 19th century into the 20th century, the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, or as we know it within the community, MOLLIS. And I would also recommend you go out online, take a look at the Mollis papers. There's some fantastic primary accounts in those papers, a great resource for historians today. And it's because of Mollis that we're standing here today. They preserved over 160 acres, largely the ground that you see standing behind me, this wonderful vista after the war. And then they gifted it to the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And it is here, it's because of them that we can walk these fields, and you can, I'm gonna ask Andy to pan out over to my right. You can see in the far distance, perhaps the monument to the 126 Ohio, and really get not just a great sense of the depth of this land, but just a great feel for where you're standing. This is an absolutely incredible vista, and you can see by visiting the battlefield why it was such an important position for the Federals. You can see why they used it as an artillery platform as the day wore on May the 12th, and that's what we're going to be talking about. But really, to set the stage for May the 12th, you got to go back to May 10th, May the 11th. As Chris mentioned, Grant has seen some initial success with Upton's assault. You can go back and watch one of our videos here during the 160th anniversary, our coverage of the Overland campaign. Grant has seen the success that Upton has had on May 10th, and he makes plans for a bigger attack to take place on May the 12th. And he's going to use the spearhead, if you will, of the Army of the Potomac, Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps. Hancock has been heavily engaged in the fighting in the wilderness around the Brock Road, Plank Road intersection of May 5th and May 6th. These men are now going to be used to make the grand assault on May 12th against the Mule Shoe Salient. But what's interesting about this attack, and we've talked a little bit about this in previous videos, is that Emory Upton, as far as we know, is not consulted as part of the planning for this operation. Hancock is going to mass his men in a large column formation, about 20,000 or so, and aim them, again, like a fist toward the tip of the Mule Shoe Salient. And we have to go back to other videos. Why wasn't Upton consulted? Again, Upton was the Sheldon Cooper, or one of the Sheldon Coopers of the Army of the Potomac. He's a very smart guy, but he's socially abrasive. He's socially awkward. He's hard to get along with from a professional perspective. Now we're going to take a walk following Landram Lane, and we're going to bring on to the camera as we go along Chris White.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I take, I don't know, a little bit of a different approach to the whole Upton's impact on this assault, because as we start to look through the lens of the federal officers on the evening of May the 11th and the morning of May the 12th, the Federals will be off to our right, massing on a place called the Landram Farm. Today it is a housing plan, but in that vicinity, the Union 2nd Army Corps will move from the right flank of the Federal Army over to roughly the left center of the Federal Army. And as the 2nd Corps is making this march, the weather's starting to turn. It's gone from hot and dry, now it's starting to rain. The guides will get lost numerous times, to the point where Francis Barlow, the 1st Division commander of the 2nd Corps, will say, well, will you at least point me in the right direction of where the enemy is, so I don't have to march all the way around the world and hit them from the rear. So what I think that with this whole Upton idea is that it's a concentration of force. But if you look at the 2nd Corps, whenever they deploy, there's no one coming out here really specifically saying, you're going to go this way, you're going to swing that way, like you would see with Upton. You also are not seeing the formations be compact the same way as or uniformed as Upton. The 1st Division will kind of make themselves into a compact punching formation, but David Bell Birney's division will come across the line fairly traditionally in the traditional lines of battle, and then John Gibbons' division will be in support off in the distance. So what I think that Grant is more doing, he's found a place in the line that is weak, the Mule Shoe Salient on Lee's side. He's also found a side, found that concentration of force will bring or bear fruit. And if he does it on the core level of approximately 20,000 Federals, he might have a larger impact rather than the 5,000 men who came across here. So I think that there's a little bit of influence from Upton. Does it hit the tactical level? I don't really think so all that much, maybe on the operational level. Also, on the Confederate side, we have to start to question the validity of Lee's line here. And let's step over here just for a minute, Andy. And if we look off to the left into this ugly looking brush, This is actually the original portion of the Landram Farm lane looking off into this direction. We're actually out on the Confederate skirmish line. This would have been manned by a Virginia brigade, once commanded by John Jones, who's killed in the wilderness today. William Witcher's in charge of that brigade down here. We'll have Virginians out here facing to the north, which is to the left side of the screen here. And then on the right side of the screen is the Mule Shoe Salient, which is a large bulge in that Confederate line. Now, the problem that we run into with Robert E. Lee is he doesn't have James Longstreet here, his kind of, angel on his shoulder to say, hey, the Mule Shoe Salient's a terrible position, and let's take a walk towards it. But he has a second in command here named Richard Ewell. Ewell's like, we can hold this line. And there's a little bit of probably a pride here because his corps had been broken about a mile off in that direction, off to the camera's left, by Emory Upton. So Ewell's going to tell him, if we pack enough infantry in here, we pack enough artillery in here, we can hold this line. It's still viable. And Lee will believe this. But on the evening of May the 11th and the morning of the 12th, Lee is actually duped by Ulysses S. Grant. As he starts to shift, as Grant does, starts to shift his men from the Brock Road sector towards the Fredericksburg Road sector, Lee misinterprets what's happening out here, and he thinks that Grant is actually going over to Route 208, the Fredericksburg Road, and he's going to retreat off the battlefield. Why he would think this, as Grant has just been on the offensive for the last week, is beyond me, but that's what he believes. And he will call to the center, Lee will, and call out most of the artillery from the center of his line on the evening of May the 11th. This is the backbone of that position. And he does it without really telling the division commander up here, a guy named Ed Johnson, who we'll cover in detail in another video. And Johnson throws a fit. How am I going to defend this area if I don't have my artillery? Over time, to make a long story short, Lee will eventually start sending that artillery back up into this position, and most of it will arrive right in time as the Federals strike the tip of the salient and arrive just in time for most of it to be captured without even firing a shot. Some will get off 1, maybe 2 rounds, but the Federals by the end of May the 13th will have captured more than 22 cannon on this portion of the battlefield and more than 3,500 Confederates, mostly from Ed Johnson's division. So Lee is told that Grant's shifting around. He starts shifting troops out of here. He starts shifting out his artillery, and now the Federals will start amassing for their assault near the Brown Farm, a mile to the north of us.
Another thing that's really important to remember, Chris mentioned that it does start to rain on the 11th of May. It's been a hot campaign thus far, pretty miserable. That rain becomes concerning to Lee because it's going to turn the roads around here to mush. And that artillery, we're stopping because there's a snake in the path. You can see it.
It's a copperhead.
Slithering off there. It's a copperhead.
Sorry, I couldn't not react to that.
Live video, folks. Live video.
Would not be the first time I've been walking along this very path and almost stepped on a snake while talking either. So Lee pulls out these artillery pieces because he's worried that they're going to get stuck in the mire of these muddy roads. So that's another reason. His artillerists actually have supported the premise that if you pack enough artillery here, you can hold the position. They supported Richard Ewell when he made that contention. Ewell had a couple really good days in the wilderness where his men successfully held off federal attacks there. So he's also feeling pretty confident and secure about his ability to hold this. So those are other factors that kind of lead to this position being held the way it is. Once those artillery pieces come out, Ewell had said he could hold it if he had enough artillery. Now he doesn't have the artillery. So that's going to be a huge, huge problem because, of course, as Chris mentioned, we've got 20,000 Federals that are massing off to the north of here. We also have more than 20,000 Federals in the 6th Corps getting ready to serve as reinforcements because what Grant wants to do is use his hammer of the 2nd Corps to smash through the tip of this salient. And then as the gap opens up, the 6th Corps is going to flood in as reinforcements. That was another thing that Grant learned following Upton's breakthrough at Dole Salient. Upton broke through. There was nobody to exploit that breakthrough. Well, now there are going to be more than 20,000 6th Corps guys ready to help exploit that breakthrough. But as Chris mentioned, nobody's out here saying, you do this, you do this, you do this. So when the Second Corps finally does break through, when we get up here in just a second, they don't know what to do. They lose momentum. They're going to actually start to get a little confused. And that Sixth Corps is supposed to come up right behind him. But because of that lack of information, the Confederates are going to have time to respond, which we'll talk about in more detail in just a second.
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk about the topography out here on the Spotsylvania battlefield. So off to my left will come about 20,000 Federal soldiers. They will make contact roughly where the tree line is. That's roughly where this Confederate skirmish line would have sat. And once they made contact there, they came across the field trying to be as quiet as possible. Then they make contact and they start to cheer and they're happy, and oh crap, that's not the actual Confederate line. That is just a skirmish line. But the Willis-Landram lane has been reinforced and it's so deep that it seems like a big trench. They have to traverse another quarter mile or so of this field, and we're halfway between right now the Confederate line, which is behind the camera, and their skirmish line. So as the Federals come down into this area, in fact, they are largely protected, because if Andy will swing around, you'll notice there's a knoll in front of us, and the Confederate line itself is in that far tree line. So the Confederates cannot see straight ahead here. We'll be coming up towards some troops from Virginia at this point and some North Carolinians. But off to the camera's right, we're actually in a small valley. This little gully here would lead right into some of the flank of Barlow's men and near where Barlow and Birney's two divisions come together, so towards that point. So the Confederates who have been in the line throughout the night, the Federals think that they're going to surprise them. But in fact, the Confederates throughout the day had figured out something's going on. Ed Johnson told his men to load their muskets, stack the arms up like they look like they're in teepee formations, and be ready in that morning because there's an assault coming. When they go to grab their muskets this morning, as the Federals come across, and one man said we counted them 17 ranks deep as they came across this field, they rise up to shoot. Although the Federals are protected from the front, they're not protected from this flank. And as the Confederates start to rise up and fire into this flank, they hear pop, 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 and not bang, bang, bang. The percussion caps go off, but Mother Nature had largely disarmed the Confederates because rainwater had got in there, dampened the powder, and now they're trying to clean out their muskets as quickly as possible. But as you're coming across this field, there are points where you are absolutely protected. There are other points where you're exposed maybe on your right or your front whenever you break through here. So if you have the opportunity to make the walk around here, and as you come across this field, watch out for copperheads. That's why you put Chris Mikowski in front so that he can chase away all the snakes. But also just take in and stop every once in a while and take in the vista. There's a little knoll behind us that would have protected the Federals. There's another knoll ahead of us that protects the Federals. And as the day wears on, after they break through the line and they are pushed back, giving away the end of the story, they will be back inside of these little valleys, utilizing them for cover, as well as places where they can reinforce the Federal line and they can bring on new ammunition.
One thing I want to mention, since we're stopped here real quick too, is the Federals are going to be advancing from my left to my right, straight across this field. But look at the way this swale cuts across diagonally. That's going to play into our story a little bit later as those 6th Corps reinforcements come in here. They're going to get down in the swale and take advantage of that protection that Chris just mentioned. So they're not going to necessarily push straight across from left to right. They're going to push into the swale, which is going to funnel them diagonally across the field off into the distance.
Path of least resistance.
Yeah, path of least resistance. And so that's going to really kind of tie into the way this attack unfolds over time. Also, as we mentioned, Chris talked about the concentration of force. And so we're going to have Francis Barlow's men in that long column, and they're going to advance kind of behind the camera. We got David Bell Birney in a straight traditional line advancing across this field. Well, as we look at this field behind us, as Barlow's men get to this knoll, they're going to kind of have to hook around, and we can see Dan Davis there standing in handsome profile inspecting the line here. So Barlow's men kind of hook around and over this knoll, which then takes that column and sends it in kind of like a left hook against the part of the Confederate line that's bending back.
They call that the East Salient.
The East Salient. And so that's, again, topography, as we've mentioned time and time again in this series, really plays a huge impact in how the boots move on this ground and unfold the battle the way it does.
And the last thing, there was a bunch of junk down here as well. Not like old car tires or things like that, but they have taken trees and chopped them down. They have put pointed sticks out here, abattis, chevaux de frise. They've put anything out here to be impediments. And the Federals, once they cross from the left of the screen to the center of your screen, they reach this point and they have to start breaking open these impediments. And as they do so, they said that's when the final rush will come through. So this will act as kind of a wave break for these Federals. They'll break through it and then keep carrying forward. And all it is going to be human momentum that will keep carrying them forward. And some of the men will stop to fire, but most of them will actually go up over top of this knoll and just hit with the force of a fist. Not 5,000 men like Upton had, but more than 20,000 men here.
And note, from where we're at, we're heading across this field. The Confederates can't see us. So Chris mentioned you get down into this protection. When the skirmish line falls, the Federals give out a large huzzah because, as Chris mentioned, they think they've captured the main line. They haven't had the time to do reconnaissance, so they're not exactly sure what they've captured. That huzzah echoes across this foggy field and lets the Confederates in the main line know, uh-oh, trouble is coming. The skirmishers who manage to get away from the skirmish line come running across the field. That's what mobilizes the Confederates. By the time they do get off their first volleys, they shoot straight across this field at the skirmish line, that far ridge where the Landram Lane was. Well, by that point, the Federals are down in here, so all those bullets go over the Federals' heads. So it's pretty ineffectual, and that allows the Federals to continue forward with that momentum Chris had mentioned.
Yeah, and as one of my favorite stories is an oral tradition, so I don't know if it's true or not, but one of the New York regiments in Miles' brigade allegedly had a pack mule with them that had all their kitchen items on it, and it broke loose prior to the assault, and it's making all this racket. And allegedly, again, according to oral tradition from some of the descendants, they ran out and tackled this mule, held it down as the assault took place so that they would still have that element of surprise. So it had to be a little bit comedic as you're charging across, seeing these guys trying to hold down a mule, then you're marching off towards the enemy.
Now, often the Park Service will do controlled burns out here to knock down the brush. They've not done so this season yet, at least as far as this filming. So things look a little kind of scraggly out here right now. But imagine this was a working subsistence farm. So this would have been open. They would have been getting ready to get the crops going here for the season. And this attack is going to really churn up this ground.
Yeah, this would have been, we would have come from the Landram Farm, intersected with Neil McCool's farm, gone down to Edgar Harrison's farm. So it's one after another, getting out of that wilderness into the open fields. And now we've come really to the center of the Confederate line. We've come to the apex of that upside down U, that Mule Shoe Salient. And that is where, this is where the Federals will start to make landfall. Though actually on the other side of the small tree line, Barlow's division will be split by that natural piece of topography, as Chris pointed out. They will make contact down in that area. They probably make contact first. You never know because these guys are always in competition with each other. But allegedly the 26th Michigan and the 140th PA will go up over top of those works and they will break the Confederate lines. Down on this portion of the line, David Bell Birney's division will also break through, and the Federals will push at least a half-mile deep into this salient. They will open up a mile-wide opening from east to west, and now they have pried open the center of the Confederate line. It'll be just a really surprising result for the Confederates, and what they're going to have to do is react. We'll talk about that in another video, but Chris?
One of the things I like about this perspective is that we look down in this direction. You can see where the Park Service maintains this mowed portion here to the left. So the Confederate line, which you can see right behind me, those have been improved works. When the Civilian Conservation Corps got this park public ready, they redug those works so they're a little higher than they would have been elsewhere on the battlefield because they've been improved. From a conservation point of view, we would never do that today, but of course they're trying to make this park ready for tourists to look at. So you can see that line pretty well. And then that mowed area gives you a good perspective of where kind of the swale starts. And if you're in the Confederate line here, you can't see down into the swale. It's a terribly laid out line. It's one reason why I'm convinced Robert E. Lee probably never personally inspected the front line right here, because his engineer eye would have easily seen like, you can't see what's in front of you. Ideally, you don't want to have those works out kind of where the end of the mowing is so you can see what's in front of you. So that gives those Federals that opportunity to come across the field using the topography for cover, and they pop right up and suddenly the Confederates are like, whoa, where did you come from? So it's a terribly laid out line. I'm really surprised. Martin Luther Smith is an engineer, the engineer who laid this out, and he's someone I admire a lot. He was involved in the Vicksburg campaign, where he commanded a brigade out there. Who was in charge of the garrison before things really heated up out there. So he'd had a lot of time being familiar with siege warfare. So I would think he would have had a better eye for the works here as well. But they're terribly laid out lines, and that really is an extra advantage for the Federals as they show up.
Yeah, Grant took that city, didn't
he? Yeah, that's
just
right. Grant had a little something to do with that, right?
Yeah. The other thing that I'll point out, though, with Martin Luther Smith, chief topographical engineer for the Army, is he has 2 stars, and Richard Ewell has 3 stars. And that means that Richard Ewell outranks him. Richard Ewell helped to man this line. This is where the Confederate Second Army Corps is laid out, and his men have been driven through from part of it. This is now, again, part of that pride of wanting to hold this line. And he's going to tell Lee, Robert E. Lee, Ewell will, if you give me enough men and you give me enough infantry, I can hold this line. This is Lee making a misjudgment. He totally misjudged that Grant was going on a retreat. He also misjudged that Ewell could hold this line. So these are some mistakes. We're starting to see operational errors within Robert E. Lee. And we'll see this in both armies. We've seen a lot of it with the Federal Army, and we'll see more with the Confederates as we get closer to Richmond and to Petersburg. But this is the wear and tear that is starting to come across these battlefields. They've been on the march for now more than a week. They've been fighting almost every day. Now this fatigue is starting to roll in. We're seeing it on the Union High Command, and now we're seeing it on the Confederate High Command.
Yeah, and we're talking obviously about how poor this Confederate position is, and you would not expect this, as Chris mentioned, with Martin Luther Smith. You wouldn't expect it with Robert E. Lee. He was an engineer in the antebellum army, a very accomplished one at that. Now, we don't really know. We can only hypothesize, theorize about how this line was formed. And one of the leading theories is that on the night of May 8th and into the early morning of the hours of May 9th, that Lee wanted to put his line, anchoring it on the right flank on the Nye River, running 3 miles over my left shoulder to the Po River. So we'd have a straight line anchored on those 2 rivers, utilizing the terrain to his advantage. But the reason why the line has to bend back off to the south and the salient is created is because Ambrose Burnside reaches the Nye River on May the 9th before the Confederates can extend out into that area. And that's why the salient is formed. But from May 9th into the morning of May 12th, when this attack takes place, Lee is actually building another line about a mile behind me to cut off this salient, to have that straight line anchored on the Po running off to Spotsylvania Court House. But that line isn't ready yet. Lee cannot abandon the salient, and he has to hold this position until that new line is ready to be manned. And that's going to play into Lee's thinking as the day goes along. Chris?
So let's wrap this up here. Andy, let's go over top of the works, and we'll bring it all together for our next video for you. So the Federals will come up over top of these earthworks. They're going to explode like a shell, go in all directions. As they go in all directions, it's going to be pandemonium for the Confederates, and Robert E. Lee is going to have to react. The ball is somewhat in his court. But as we look at the 50,000-foot level here at Spotsylvania Court House, what do we have taking place? First off, we have Ulysses S. Grant making attacks towards this point. Those go off about 4:35 in the morning. Off to my right, miraculously, Ambrose Burnside attacked basically on time. Think about that one, folks, for you anti-Burnside people. But we have a big fan back here named Chris Mikowski. Burnside makes his attacks. Where do we not see attacks? At a place called Laurel Hill. Gouverneur Kimball Warren, the wonderkind of the Union Army, or if you watch Ted Lasso, the Wonder Kid, he is going to attack He's not going to attack across Laurel Hill. In fact, it will become so heated at Federal High Command that Grant will send one of his mentors, one of Warren's mentors over there to say, if he will not attack there, relieve him and bring his soldiers to a different point where they will do the most good. Warren will not be relieved here. 11 months later, he will be at a place called Five Forks. But the 5th Corps will later on in the day be brought into action, as will the 6th Corps. And we'll have a massive traffic jam that'll start to take place, which we'll unpack in our other videos. If we also look at that 50,000 foot level, what do we start to have happening right now? The Bermuda 100 campaign is starting to take place. We're moving up the peninsula. We're going to have David Hunter starting to move through the Shenandoah Valley. We also have William T. Sherman moving from Chattanooga down into Georgia. Grant has Lee pinned in place here at Spotsylvania Court House, and now the body blows of the other Union armies are going to start to land on the Confederacy. We all know in 2020 hindsight that they all don't go all that well for the Federals. But in real time, with Robert E. Lee, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, we now have to react to multiple sectors, and we have to take on this guy named Grant here in the east, and we have to start fighting in the west, the Trans-Mississippi Theater, the Red River, and then below Richmond near Petersburg. So there's a lot of things starting to happen all at once. And with that, I want to thank Andy behind the camera. I want to thank our snake wrangler, Chris Mikowski, for leading the way across the field here. Sarah Byerly's back there, Dan Davis, and I'm Chris White. Thank you for watching. Please share this with your friends, hit that subscribe button and that like button. Head over to battlefields.org, learn more about what we do, and thank you for supporting battlefield education and preservation.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.